One of the great warnings that crops up again and again in the Bible is a warning not to forget God. And I think it would be awfully strange if any of us did. I mean, how in the world could you forget that God is? I mean, has there ever been a time in your life when you have forgotten that, when you didn't know that? Well, whenever God comes along and says, be really careful that you don't forget God, I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think what he means by that is that you don't forget the deal that we have. You don't forget the relationship. You don't forget that I am involved with what you are doing, that I have an interest in your life, and that you have an interest in conducting your life according to the instructions that I've given you. In other words, it's not just the forgetting about God. It's forgetting the deal we have with him and forgetting the way in which we are supposed to be working with him. It's odd, I think, in some religious circles, how much contempt you find for the Old Covenant. And I think that it's because people do not really understand the deal that was involved. The truth is that the Old Covenant for Israel was a heck of a deal. You got to remember where these people were, who they were, what they had been, and what they had been subjected to. They had been 400 years plus in slavery. Those people, through their ancestors, had been in slavery longer than slavery was ever practiced in the United States. They had to work, 12 days a week, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. They had to work until they from the time they could in the morning until the time they couldn't work at night. They were slaves. They were degraded. In fact, sometimes you can only begin to understand the extent to which these people had slipped, how far down they had gone in the reading of the laws that tell them in the minutest details some of the things they have to do just to get themselves clean. That the laws of cleanliness and uncleanliness in the Old Testament in many ways were laws designed for a slave people. They were designed for a people who had forgotten how to keep clean, who had forgotten how to eat right, who did not have any idea of how to actually live a life. And that is so foreign to us, people living in a modern world who think that we are free, that we cannot appreciate what they had to go through. Now, do you want to hear something really strange? The first checkoff God gave them, coming out of Egypt, to see whether or not we could actually go forward and keep the commandments and so forth, was to teach these people how to not work so hard. Now, that sounds simple, doesn't it? I mean, that sounds like there's no big deal. You think that's easy to teach a people how to not work so hard. Well, it's not nearly as easy as you think it would be. And I've kind of cast around my mind for a way to help you understand that. And I had a book that I had read not long ago called Man's Search for Meaning by a man named Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a German psychiatrist. I've mentioned him before. He was a psychiatrist in Germany before the war, and he had the very unfortunate circumstance of being Jew. He was taken to a concentration camp. He was in Auschwitz for a while. He was passed around because he was a physician to various other camps as well. And he did survive the period of time that he was there. And he wrote this book. The first half of the book is about his experiences in the concentration camp. And it's not one of these books that are designed to shock you. It's not designed to overwhelm you with blood and gore and this type of thing. All it is a physician's account, a psychiatrist's account of the things that they went through with a clinical interest in the way in which they affected the spirit, the mind, the heart, the whole man, as it were, through the course of that period of time that they were in this concentration camp. Now, these people were slaves. They were slaves not for 400 years, not for all their lives. They were slaves for something like 5 to 6 years through the concentration camp experience, maybe some of them a little longer than that. But I think in his case it was like 5 or 6 years that he was there. They were carried off, as the old story goes, in boxcars on trains, jammed into where you couldn't even sit down in the thing. You basically had to stand up and jostle against one another for the whole journey. They managed sometimes to relieve themselves in the corner, and sometimes they didn't manage to get to the corner. It was a horrible, degrading experience from the time they started until the time they got wherever they were going. And when they got where they were going, they were taken into a place they were undressed. They were not merely undressed. They were taken all the way down to the skin. They were shaved. Every hair was shaved off of their bodies. That's the part of the delousing process.
And whenever all that was done, they were left standing shivering in the cold for the remainder of the day, and sometimes down near freezing temperatures. And several of them in the group were doctors, they were kind of curious, apart from their discomfort, with whether or not they would all come down with colds and pneumonia and what would happen to them. And they were all very surprised when the experience was over with that none of them did. But then he follows through with this description of the complete loss of freedom, the complete loss of dignity, the fact that the meager rations that they were held on for this period of time as they all wasted away to mere flesh and bones. And most of you have seen the pictures of what those men looked like when they were liberated from the concentration camp, so you know how gaunt, how thin they were. They were used, the ones that survived it were used essentially as slave labor. Many of the people who went there, because they weren't capable of work, weren't strong enough for work, weren't useful, as was the case with women and children, were disposed of right away. Those who could work were warned immediately by the people who were there ahead of them that try not to limp when you walk out there. No matter how bad your feet hurt, try not to limp. Because if they perceive that you can't work and that you can't work effectively, they'll ship you off on the next boxcar and you'll never be heard from again. And so they worked. Whether they hurt, whether they had blisters, it didn't matter. You ignored the pain. You went right ahead and worked. And they worked all day. And they slept on beds that were nothing but boards. Just a little box of boards. They slept with 6 of them, I think, to one bed across so many feet to where they all had to basically, when one of them turned over, all of them had to turn over. And this is the way, month in, month out, year in, year out, that these men had to live their lives. I'm only underlining this for you to help you to understand that in a period of just a mere 5 or 6 years, these men had come to a certain frame of mind. Toward the end of this experience, Viktor Frankl had an occasion one night when something had happened in the camps to where one of the prisoners who was responsible, one other group were responsible for him, had stolen some potatoes. And the Germans said that they would either give this man up so they could hang him, or they would all go without rations for a day. Some 2,500 of the men that were there decided they would fast for that day. And toward the end of that day, when they were all feeling terrible and lying around in their bunkhouse, all the lights went out, which made it even worse, and they were all depressed. And the leader of them there began to speak to them. And he asked Viktor Frankl, as a psychiatrist, to speak to them, which he did in the dark there among them. And one of the things he told them was even that late, he calculated that many of them were still not going to make it. He knew that. And he calculated his own chances at that point were about 1 in 20 at best that he would survive the concentration camp experience. Well, the part of the book that I was looking forward to as I read it was when they came to the release, I was curious to know how these men felt. Because with all that I have seen about this in the past, I've never really had anyone who had explained the psychological feeling, what the effect was, and how they felt on the day when finally they were free. And the Allied troops rolled up, and the gates to the camp were rolled open, and finally there was food to eat. What did they do? How did they live from that time forward? I'm going to take you to page 94 in his book. I want to read a section of it to you because I think it helps us to understand something that's important for us to understand. He said, with tired steps, we prisoners dragged ourselves to the camp gates. Timidly, we looked around and we glanced at each other questioningly. Then we ventured a few steps out of the camp. This time, no orders were shouted at us, nor was there any need to duck quickly to avoid a blow or a kick. Oh no. This time, the guards offered us cigarettes. We hardly recognized them at first. They had hurriedly changed into civilian clothes. We walked slowly along the road leading from the camp. Soon our legs hurt and threatened to buckle, but we limped on. We wanted to see the camp's surroundings for the first time with the eyes of free men. Freedom, we repeated to ourselves, and we could not grasp it. We had said this word so often during all the years we had dreamed about it, it had lost its meaning. Its reality did not penetrate our consciousness. We could not grasp the fact that freedom was ours. We came to meadows full of flowers. We saw and realized that they were there, but we had no feelings about them. The first spark of joy came when we saw a rooster with a tail of multicolored feathers. But it remained only a spark. We did not yet belong to this world. In the evening, when we all met again in our hut, one said secretly to the other, tell me, were you pleased today? And the other replied, feeling ashamed as he did not know that we all felt the same way. Truthfully, no. We had literally lost the ability to feel pleased and had to relearn it slowly. Psychologically, what was happening to the liberated prisoners could be called depersonalization. Everything appeared unreal, unlikely, as in a dream. We could not believe it was true. How often in the past years had we been deceived by dreams? We dreamt that the day of liberation had come. We dreamt that we had been set free, and they did. They would dream in their night. They would have all these dreams about liberty. They embraced our wives, sat down at the table, and started to tell all the things we had gone through, even how we had seen the day of liberation in our dreams. And then a whistle would shrill in our ears, the signal to get up, and our dreams of freedom came to an end. And now, the dream had come true. But could we really believe in it? The body has fewer inhibitions than the mind. The body made good use of the new freedom, and from the first moment on, it began to eat ravenously for hours and days, even half the night. It's amazing what quantities one could eat. And when one of the prisoners was invited out by a friendly farmer in the neighborhood, he ate, and then drank coffee, which loosened his tongue, and then began to talk often for hours. The pressure which had been on his mind for years was released at last. Hearing him talk, one got the impression that he had to talk, that his desire to speak was irresistible. I have known people who have been under heavy pressure for only a short time, for example, through a cross-examination by the Gestapo, to have similar reactions. Many days passed until not only the tongue was loosened, but something inside oneself as well. Then feelings suddenly broke through the strange fetters that surrounded it. Finally, at long last, feelings began to break through. One day, a few days after the liberation, I walked through the country past flowering meadows for miles and miles toward the market town near the camp. Larks rose to the sky, and I could hear their joyous song. There was no one to be seen for miles around. There was nothing but the wide earth and the sky and the lark's jubilation and the freedom of space. I stopped and looked around and up to the sky, and then I went down on my knees. At that moment, there was very little I knew of myself or of the world. I had but one sentence in mind, always the same. Quote, I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space. How long I knelt there and repeated the sentence, memory can no longer recall, but I know that on that day, in that hour, my new life started. Step for step, I progressed until I again became a human being. You know, I read that, and it helps me to understand something. I think that is very difficult for us to understand because we have lived as free men and women. We've always had plenty to eat. You know, we have jobs we go to and jobs we can quit if we want to. We can go back, you know, we go home in the evening and we sit and watch television. We have warm houses to go back to. And I don't think we understand sometimes the dynamics that we encounter when we read certain passages in the Bible. Remember I said to you that God, on the way to Sinai, had to teach these people how not to work quite so hard? This gives us, I think, a fresh look at Exodus, the 16th chapter, which is where I want to take you now. Because this is something which we've talked about before. Preachers have taken it who are talking about the Sabbath and the importance of the Sabbath to the church. And we have looked at this in one way, but I don't think we have quite grasped exactly what is going on in the 16th chapter of Exodus. It says, they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after departing out of Egypt. They were free men for 1 month. And the whole congregation of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The children of Israel said, would God we had died by the hand of the Lord while we were still in Egypt, where we sat by the flesh plots, where we ate bread to the full. Those people, even though they were slaves, had food to eat. The Egyptians didn't realize that they didn't want to starve these people if they expected to continue to get work out of them, so they did have food to eat while they were in Egypt. Unlike the concentration camps, where the Germans themselves did not have all that much food, and certainly had none that they could afford to give to prisoners. He said, you have brought us into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Then said the Lord to Moses, behold, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people will go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or not. This is a test. And it shall come to pass on the 6th day, they shall prepare what they bring in. It shall be twice as much as they gather daily. Now, we have often preached from this passage to demonstrate that God created the Sabbath, that he gave the Sabbath to Israel. It was not just 1 day out of 7. It was a specific day
They couldn't pick which day they were going to observe. They had to observe this one particular day. And all those arguments are fair enough. But I don't think that we have approached this from a perspective, or quite the perspective, that these people were experiencing this thing that was happening to them at this time. Because they were capable of understanding in depth what was going on. The consequence of this is they had to be taught things in a form of discipline very different from what you or I might require. If God were trying to train us, He would probably approach us in rather a different way. Well, at verse 13 it says, "It came to pass that at even the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, the face of the wilderness, on the face of the wilderness, there lay a small round thing like hoarfrost on the ground. And when they saw it, they said to one another, What's that? Because they didn't know what it was. And, of course, the word manna means, what's it, or what is that? Moses called them and said, This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man, according to the number of your persons. Take you every man for them which are in his tents. And the children of Israel did so. And they gathered, some more, some less. And when they measured it out with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over. He that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating." In other words, you got to measure. You go out and you gather this much per person, and that way each day you will have precisely what you need to eat on that day. Nobody got hungry. Now Moses was very specific. He said, "Let no one leave of it till the morning." But, as is always the case, they didn't listen to him. So they kept it till morning, and it bred worms and stank, and you could smell it all over the place, and Moses, you couldn't hide it. Moses was furious with them. They gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating, and when the sun waxed hot, it melted. And it came to pass, on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. And they came and told Moses, the people are doubling up. Moses said that's what they're supposed to do. It's what God said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today. Seethe what you will seethe today. Whatever is left over, you lay it up until the morning. And so they did. They laid it up to the morning, and it did not stink, and there were no worms. So we got a miracle. They are being taught very deliberately the Sabbath day. Remember, here are people who have worked 7 days a week all their lives. Now we come to a point in time where we're going to have to break a very old habit, and we're going to have to learn how to rest. And I thought about this, and I thought about Viktor Frankl, and I thought how that he had to learn how to experience pleasure again. Much less how to rest, much less how to let down, to slow down, to stop working. And I think here we are in the 20th century, and many of us have similar problems, this time not because any human being is beating us about the head and the shoulders. It's just that we have to work, and we can't stop working. And we run up against a problem when we come to the Sabbath day, and we have this problem of trying to unwind. And so God, with ancient Israel, gave them the discipline of the Sabbath day to require them to stop so they would have time for their bodies to unwind, for their minds to unwind, and for them to commune with Him. It was a very important step for them to take. And so the lesson was taught. It came to pass that some of them went out on the 7th day and they didn't find anything. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long is it going to take these people to pick up on this? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, He gives you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Stay at home. Don't let anybody go out of his place on the Sabbath day." Now, that particular commandment, don't go out of your place on the Sabbath day, doesn't make a whole lot of sense in a world where we've got cars and we can jump in the car and drive across town to visit mom and dad. That wasn't the point here. The point was here we are learning the discipline here of stopping work. Stopping, the preparation of food. We're stopping all this stuff. We're slowing everybody down. We have got to teach these former slaves how to rest, how to slow down, how to change their lives. So the people rested on the 7th day. How hard is this? It's really pretty simple. In the 20th century, it's as simple as falling off a log. But for concentration camp survivors, which is what Israel was, those people walking out of Egypt, it's just not that simple. It's silly, I think, to imagine that the Sabbath would be revealed to 20th century man in the same terms.
I think 20th century man would have to have another kind of discipline. God would approach us differently in trying to teach us how to keep the Sabbath day. Make no mistake about it. The Sabbath has not been abolished, but we need to stop looking at it like we're slaves. And the reason I say that is it has not been any time at all ago that I was very frustrated by this. And here we are on our CEM and Friends forum on the Internet, and somebody posts on the subject line, Sabbath bondage. And it was really incredible to me to read that and to read the message that the guy put under it and the presumption that the Sabbath day is a yoke of bondage. Now, the very fact that Israel had to have some discipline and had to be taught the things that they were going to need to do, to call that a yoke of bondage is incredible stupidity from my perspective, the way I look at it. The Sabbath was the first liberating principle of the law of God. It was the first step he took to teach people how to be free men. Think about it. He had to go into Egypt and bring them out. It took God to liberate them. It took a bunch of plagues. It took the death of the firstborn in Egypt. It took all that stuff for Pharaoh to finally say, okay, you can go. And he took them out there. He brought them dry shod across the bottom of the Red Sea. And on the way, the very first thing he taught them about being free men was that they didn't have to work every day of their lives. Not only they didn't have to work every day, they actually had to rest one day. They had to set aside a day in which they were going to be able to draw near to God, to study God's Word, to be able to hear His Word, to be able to think and to meditate and to talk about God and the things that God had done with them. All this was brought upon them. As I say, it was the first liberating principle of the law of God. And like a pack of fools, man doesn't want to be free. Doesn't want to be free. He wants to work 7 days a week. And so we'll work 5 days a week at our job for our employer, for our master. And then we'll come home on the weekend and we'll work 2 days on the weekend pursuing our own things about family and yard and painting the house and all the things that we've got to do. And we'll just go right on through and work 7 days a week just like we were slaves. Even though God says, no, don't do that. You're free men. And that brings me to another liberating principle that's very closely related, I think, to Thanksgiving. It's in Deuteronomy, the 8th chapter. All the commandments that I command you this day, observe to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers. And you will remember all the way which the Lord led you these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you, to prove you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep my commandments or not. Now, I want you to keep something in mind now. And you need to keep this in mind all the way through any readings you do of the Old Testament and the law in particular. That the point of the law is liberation. It is not bondage. From the beginning to the end, it is liberation, not bondage. Now, it may look occasionally odd to you as a 20th century person, but that's because you haven't been a slave for 400 years. You weren't born in slavery. You didn't grow up in slavery. You didn't live in a slave-ridden culture. And so consequently, many of the things that you will read in the law, you may understand from the wrong perspective. The fact is that as you read the law was to protect the rights of individuals. It was to keep us from hurting one another. It was to keep us from hurting ourselves, from stepping on the rights of people around us. It was good. It was liberating. It was free. And that's why when you come to the New Testament, it is called the perfect law of liberty, not bondage. And it is curious how man, I suppose there's something down inside of us that keeps drawing us back to becoming slaves again, want to enslave ourselves and other people to the law. And we find ways of making the law onerous and burdensome. And Jesus, says, come unto me. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. That whatever burden I lay upon you is going to be a whole lot easier than the burdens that the world lays upon you. And the analogy is beautiful between the burdens that the Egyptians laid upon them and the burdens that God laid upon them in the 40 years of wilderness wandering, which I'm sure they complained a lot about it every day. But the fact of the matter is that when they were in the wilderness, they had food to eat. They got hungry once in a while, but none of them got fat that way. They had enough to eat. They had places to sleep. There were people around them that they loved. They got married. They partied. They had kids. They had celebrations. They lived out there. They didn't die out there. They died off as old people, but the wilderness didn't kill them off. They grew old out there, and they died out there. It's as simple as that.
And God took care of them through all that period of time. And he said, we were doing an exercise out there. I wanted to know whether or not you would keep my laws or not. In a sense, the wilderness wanderings were a time in which Israel was exercised in the rights of freedom. Rights, R-I-T-E-S. The ceremonies, those things that we have to do to learn how, once again, to be free men and women. His commandments were not burdensome, and they weren't grievous. They did restrict their ability to hurt one another and to do stupid things like sacrificing their children to other gods and idols, real bondage stuff. It goes on to say in verse 3, God humbled you and suffered you to hunger, and he fed you with manna, which you'd never heard of before. Neither did your fathers know it. He did it to make you know that man does not live by bread only, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord does man live. Man does not live by bread only. Remember what Jesus said when he was in the wilderness and been fasting 40 days and 40 nights, and the devil came to him and tempted him and said, hey, if you're the Son of God, command that stone be made bread. We'll sit down, we'll have something to eat. Jesus said, it's written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. He went on to say, all that time you were wandering around in the desert out there, your clothing didn't get old, your foot didn't swell, all this 40 years. And you shall consider in your heart that as a father chastens his son, so the Lord chastens you. I didn't do these things to you to hurt you. I did them to train you, to teach you, to give you discipline, so that you could live as free men. Because you see, one of the primary considerations for any person who is going to live free in the world is that discipline has got to be inside. The undisciplined man, the undisciplined spirit isn't free either. It is the one who has internalized the discipline, who has the Word of God in his heart, in his mind, and the law in his heart and mind, and who has that discipline inside. This is the person who can live free. Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to fear him. For the Lord your God brings you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, fountains, depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land in which you shall eat bread without scarceness. Man, you think about that. Think about Viktor Frankl coming out of that concentration camp, where I think his ration every day was something like 10 ounces of bread and one small bowl of soup with nothing but the broth. That was it. All day. Every day. And how that they would oftentimes hide the bread in their clothes and sneak a little pinch of it every so often just to make it last through the day, because they knew it was all they were going to get. Picture people like that who are now being told, you're going into this land that's got barley and wheat and vines so that you can pluck off the fresh ripe grapes and eat them, how that there are fig trees, and you've never had a fig until you've had a tree ripened, fresh, big juicy fig off the tree. Pomegranates, olive oil, fresh, extra virgin, squeeze it yourself. A land wherein you shall eat bread without scarceness, and you can slather the honey on it as well and butter. Get all you want. He said it's a land wherein you will not lack anything, and whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you may dig brass. Now let's keep it in mind. Israel were slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians took everything, and they gave the Israelites barely enough to live on. You got the picture? God is giving Israel a good land. They don't have to buy it. They won't be able to sell it either, because it's being given to them by lot. It isn't theirs. They don't own it. God owns the land. But they are being given this land to live on. They can live on it, and they can work it. It's theirs. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. He said, basically, you're to kind of have a Thanksgiving day every day. It's so wonderful in our country that we have a day of national Thanksgiving, a national holiday that's designed for Thanksgiving. And there's no getting around it, folks. It is the one thing, as we stop it in this land, it's an official thing that we as people in this country do, that is truly directed at God. For where else are you going to give your thanks but to God who gives us this good land? And what a description of our own country, to consider the wealth of this nation that God has given us to live in it. He says, when you've eaten and are full, everything is going your way,
You shall bless the Lord your God. That means thank Him for it. Give Him credit for it. Bless Him with what you do. But it's more than that. How do you go about blessing God for the things that He's given you? Let's say declare a day of thanksgiving. We take off work another day. Actually, in our case, 2 days. Reading proclamation, making prayers of saying thanksgiving, singing songs. Yeah. All that, I'm sure. Is there a more concrete way of blessing God than that? Because anybody can say words. Anybody can take a day off work. Right? Is there a more concrete way of blessing God? Well, now, normally, sharecroppers have to give what? About half the crop to the owner of the land? I remember many times back in the old days in Arkansas, we'd be driving along, we'd go by these properties, and there'd be these little shotgun shacks on there, and fields of cotton out there, and they were sharecroppers who worked these lands. That they didn't own it, somebody else owned it, and they were given the right to go out and work the land. They had to plant the cotton, harvest the cotton, had to do all the work that was done out there. And when all was said and done, they didn't get to keep everything. They had to give the owner of the land half of what came off of that land. They had a deal with the owner. That was their deal. The Egyptians, on the other hand, they took more than that. The Egyptians probably took something like 90% of everything that was produced by the Israelites, and they had to get by with whatever was left over when all was said and done. I don't think many people really think of it this way because they look upon it somehow or other from the wrong angle. Do you realize that the deal God cut with Israel, remember I said to you that I thought the old covenant was a heck of a deal? That God provided the land. He provided everything that was there, the rain that fell on it, the land, the crops, everything that was theirs. It was a land that you could have bread without scarceness, olive oil, wheat, barley, and all this good stuff. That instead of saying, you got to give me half, God says, you can keep 90% of it. Remember what I told you about the Sabbath day? How that it was one of the great liberating principles of God? How that the point of the Sabbath day was to set men free, not to bind them down? Do you ever realize that the law of the tithe is designed to set men free, not tie them down? It's designed to say to you, you can keep with a clear conscience 90% of everything that I give you. And like a pack of fools, men will sit around and moan and groan and kvetch about the fact that God is exacting somehow or other this 10% of what is rightfully theirs. We just really have a hard time getting on the right side of these questions and understanding the incredible liberating principles that we run up against again and again and again. God moves to give us freedom, and we interpret it as bondage. That's the kind of perverse minds that we have got. Verse 11, he says, beware that you don't forget the Lord your God in not keeping His commandments. Just don't make that mistake. Keep His commandments and His judgments and His statutes, which I command you this day. Because the point of the law is liberty. It's to give you freedom. It's so that every man can sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree. So that you can be unmolested by your own government, unmolested by your enemies, that you can have the freedom to live your life your way. Which sometimes means the freedom to suffer hardship when you do things that are stupid. Lest when you have eaten and are full, and you have built goodly houses and you're living there, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, everything you have is multiplied, that your heart be lifted up, and you forget the deal between you and the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of bondage. Remember what I said earlier? It isn't just a matter of forgetting that God is. It's a matter of forgetting the relationship. It's forgetting the deal. It's forgetting the fact that God is actively involved in what's going on down here and cares very much about how you live your life, about how you treat your neighbor, about how you relate to Him, about how that you acknowledge Him in the things that you do, and how that you, when you've eaten and are full, turn and bless God. You forget the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. You know, it was Jacob who said it. You know, Abraham, when he had defeated the men who had taken Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah captive and brought back them and all the spoil with him, it was Abraham who, when Melchizedek came up and said, "Blessed be Abraham of God, who has given you your enemies into your hand," he made the statement, what you have is what God has given you. Abraham immediately paid tithes to Melchizedek as an acknowledgement of that, then gave all the rest of the stuff back to the people from whom it had been taken.
Then his son Jacob, when he was on his way to another land, he gets to the place where he sets up the pillar stone, sees the angels going up and down Jacob's ladder to heaven, and he says, oh my, he was overwhelmed by what had happened. And he promised God and made a deal with God. And he said, of all that you give me, I will surely give the 10th to you. Why? Well, because Jacob recognized that God was handing this stuff down to him. And somehow or other, we don't know the actual origins of the concept, or when it was actually shown to man that somehow or other this 10% was what God expected. But Abraham understood it, and apparently Jacob understood it as well when the time came for it. Here's the principle that I think you have to come down to. If God has given you nothing, then you don't owe God a thing. Simple, isn't it? God's given you nothing. You don't owe him anything. You owe him nothing. If you have done it all yourself, if you built it all yourself, you managed to get it all yourself, if you amassed your fortune yourself, if you did all the stuff that you have done all by yourself, you owe God absolutely nothing. If God has given you everything you have, then you owe him everything. Right? Everything. But all he asks is a tenth. Says you can keep all the rest. It's a simple proposition. I'm not talking about some law where you've got the IRS that's going to come in and examine all of your bank accounts and all this kind of stuff and confiscate your houses, your lands, your properties. God doesn't work that way. God has no IRS. There's no, the Levitical priesthood had no IRS. There's nobody from the church, from God, that's supposed to come around and examine your funds and say, we're taking 10% of everything you've got here. Nothing like that. What the tithe involves is a statement on your part that says, I recognize that God has given me all of this, and I am going to give the 10th to him. That's where it comes from. It is really hard, I think, for us to realize that we are free. That we are free. I am so grateful to be living in a land that is as free as it is. We sometimes complain and gripe about our lack of freedom, how the government's trying to take them away from us all the time. We forget that we're the government. We forget that we have the responsibilities to kind of oversee our government. We forget the fact that it's not just somebody off in Washington that's doing these things, that all of us in our country have neglected the freedoms that have been given to us. We have not been really careful. We have not been true patriots. We have not been good stewards of the freedom that has been given our way. We have not always recognized God as the source of every good and perfect gift. We have not really accepted the fact that George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and all the great leaders of our country knew and told us about whenever they actually proclaimed these things on Thanksgiving, that these things, all these gifts, all this great stuff comes to us from God who has given it into our hands. And somehow, I'm not appreciating the freedom that we have. We are at times seem prepared to give it away, to let it go. One of the greatest principles, though, involved in the freedom that you'll ever experience is the acknowledgement that freedom has its price. That freedom has its price, and that price is often paid in the blood and flesh of people, of human lives. That our freedom had a price in the blood and the flesh of Jesus Christ, who died in our place. And to him, we surely owe everything that we have. It's hard sometimes to remember we're free. It's hard to pick up the responsibility of freedom. It's hard to act like people who have the discipline inside and who are free men and women. And when I start forgetting these things, I call to mind the prayer that Viktor Frankl made out in the middle of that field, in the middle of nowhere, with the skylarks larking about him, with the flowers in the field, free for the first time in so many years and still not quite making it all out. I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space.